Let's go to the main menu and click Guides. In the search box at the top, type in Ralph. Locate under Workflows, Ralph West's Weaving the Textual Web, and click it. Let's go ahead and put in a Bible reference, Genesis 1:1. Notice the drop-down menu. To confirm what you've typed in, click Genesis 1:1. Let's go ahead and expand this window to use all our layout. Now, Ralph West has put together his methodology for us. You can see at the left his 8 steps. Let's take a closer look to see what this methodology involves. So first off, we have selecting the threads. And therefore, he talks about planning ahead, which is so critical. Talks about considering a series preaching, also planning the series. And this is some extra helps and some questions so you can do this thoroughly. Let me stress, this is something that's overlooked in the pulpit all too often. A pastor or a team in the leadership really should, at the end of the year or the beginning of the new year, plan out the preaching for the whole year. Of course, things are subject to change, but there should be a plan and an intention to cover a certain amount of ground. Of course, this takes into account the holidays and other calendar items. It can be very useful for the church. Now, step 2 is treating the text. And you can see here there's quite a bit of information on all that's involved. This is the process of studying. Reflect on your passage selection. Notice the important questions added here. Establish the boundaries of the passage. You're going to use the Compare Pericope tool. Read your passage several times. You've seen this before in multiple steps, and it really is important to do. Identify the basic facts of your passage. These are going to be the things that stand out and are very important, especially background information. Read your passage in the original languages. And I love this step because without access to the original language, you really do lose a lot of the important precision in the meaning. Step 2.6, read your passage closely and carefully. Notice there is a link to compare Bible versions and some additional questions. Now, when you do look at other Bible versions, what are you really gaining there? Well, you're seeing word differences and you're seeing the meaning expressed. When you combine that with the original language study, you can get a much better understanding of what the passage is saying. We have identified important words. We've seen this before, and that is a bridge or jumping off point to additional word studies. Examining literary types, pretty straightforward there, looking at the genre. Identify biblical events. There's the list of all the biblical events related to your passage. We have examining the cultural context. You can see the cultural concepts list there. The historical context, again, a link to the timeline tool. Identify things and objects. We haven't seen this really yet in any of the methodologies. It's important to note the things that are mentioned in the passage. They can sometimes lead to a very fascinating insight. Identify biblical cross-references. We have the important passage links. In step 2.16, we're going to consult the commentaries, and this is where you're going to confirm your work, check your work, see what you got right, what you got wrong, and what may be missing. Now, at this point, you've done a lot of research, but you really haven't put the information down in a presentable way. So in step 3, we're going to have write the preliminary page. Now, if you've ever seen Ralph West preach, he does a lot of this from memory, and he's gifted in that particular way. So you may not be able to pull all this off through your memory, but you could do it with a manuscript. So step 3.1, write out the central idea of the text, also known as the CIT, and the thematic outlines can help you do that. This is so important that you have this clearly understood at the beginning of the preaching process, because without it, you don't have a direction. And it also helps you determine what you keep and what you discard with all the information that you have discovered. Then determine the main objective of the text, that is the MOT. Now, Logos just gives you the literary typing, and that's not really that helpful here. This is a step you may not have seen before, and what Ralph is describing here is that you should give thought again to what type of text you're reading. Is it doctrinal, ethical, consecrated, prophetic, exhortative, and pastoral? So that's why the genre is here. Once you determine the text objective, you can start thinking about how you might want to approach the message. The literary types that you examine in an earlier step may be worth considering again. So when he talks about the main objective, he's saying this in a very general sense. What is the purpose of the text? If it's a historical narrative, clearly the purpose of the text is to relay some history. Now, that's from a very general standpoint, but look at the questions. that he adds. What type of text are you preaching from? And what is the main objective of the text? In other words, what is it doing? Now, that's a very important question, and that needs to be added here. Then we have write the thesis statement for the sermon. And the thesis in the sermon is a concise statement. Every word is connected to it. All the arguments flow from it. It can be a question, it can be a sentence, or a problem that needs to be resolved. And this really helps you focus all your research and the message to this idea. All right, so in writing the thesis statement, he has this question: what is the primary way this passage communicates the good news of Jesus Christ? Now, it's always important to be first and foremost true to the text. And if the text leads you down the gospel, then you most certainly should do that. But if it doesn't, don't force this message in. And that's really key. First, explain the text. When it comes to application, make sure the application flows from your study of the text. And if there's an opportunity for the good news, then sure, bring that in. Just make sure you're not letting the tail wag the dog. In other words, forcing in the gospel of Jesus Christ and the good news when the text is not demanding that. All right, number 3.4, establish the main objective for the sermon. And here's the questions he gives you to guide this process. What do I want the hearers to learn? What do I want my audience to know? What do I want my audience to become? And what do I want my audience to do? These are really important. Learning, becoming, and doing. These are really important questions, and make sure they all flow from the text. And then 3.5, write a title for the sermon. A title can be very helpful because it guides your thinking. If you're writing on the topic of heaven, then everything that flows from that sermon should somehow point back to the title heaven. All right, in step number 4, we have weaving the weft, scripting your outline. Now, I'm going to read this because it's pretty fascinating insight here. In weaving the warp, the taut vertical threads are interwoven with the weft, the horizontal threads, to form fabric. At this point, you should be able to see the fabric of your sermon begin to take shape. You are now ready to script your sermon, constructed from the movements in the biblical text, regardless of their number, whether 1, 2, 5. You want to determine the movements of the text. The text must shape your sermon because the scripture is your authority. And that's a great point. Whatever may be the issue, need, or subject you're addressing, its authority is rooted in the ancient text. The supremacy of God in preaching should be your passion and aim in proclamation. Thus, the Bible is your authority. When he talks about movements, what he's talking about is arguments or significant changes or moments in the text that are conveying important information. That's what you're looking for. These become really the main points of the passage. Number 5 is threading the needle, preparing to write. Now, you're going to reflect and meditate on the text, and you can see some of the questions there. Prepare your sermon materials for writing. And then number 5, make a writing schedule. Now, I'll be honest with you. If you're preaching and teaching on a regular basis, you probably already have this figured out. You know how long it takes to study. You know how long it takes to write the sermon. You know when that message should be done, when you're reviewing, etc. So this is just to guide you to start thinking along the lines that you need to be more systematic and intentional in your sermon process. All right, number 6, beating the fabric. We have create a sermon document. Logos will create a link to the sermon document tool. You'll write your introduction. Now, this is kind of fascinating to me. The way I study and preach and teach, I hold off on the introduction and conclusion until I have finished my body. Now, it's true on occasion, I may know the passage so well that I already have the introduction or the conclusion in mind. So it's really important you know where you're going. And I would suggest this, that before you write your introduction, you have established your main points. So you might disagree a little bit with this step. But again, it depends on where you're at in the study process. There's nothing wrong with writing an introduction right away if you know where you're going. Here we have the main points, and this is going to be your body of your passage. And once you've got that done, now you just need to look for illustrations and applications. So Logos links you to the illustration tool, and then we have formulate an application for your sermon. And there is some help there. Now that you've done the introduction, the body with illustrations and applications, we all agree that the conclusion really should come last. And it makes sense. You're landing the plane. You understand what you've just said, where you've been, where you're going, and now you've arrived at your destination. It's time to write the conclusion. The last step, the finished product, is really about reviewing checking your work, and making sure that you are ready to present your message to the people. I think Ralph West's Weaving the Textual Web is a wonderful contribution to the Logos library, and it's definitely worth spending some time looking through this methodology. Let's go ahead and close this by clicking on the X on the tab located here.